All right.
Okay.
So we've just pulled up.
No, we haven't.
Okay.
Nina and I have spent too long together.
Well, I was going to say what's on the sign. Certainly helps you, no?
Yeah, I know where we are. That's right.
For the recording audience.
We've started to bicker at each other. I'm waiting for you to say, so Dan, where are we?
Well, I was going to... You know what? For once I was going to say where we were.
Yeah, but we hadn't pulled up. Should we not bicker anymore?
Fuck it. All right.
But in fairness, we're 2 years in to working on this podcast. Months past where we expected to finish. And we're both tired. Can we do a piece to microphone?
Just talk.
I'll talk.
Yeah.
Okay. You record, I'll talk. We're also still driving. Right now, we're near the small town of Old Bar on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, which is about 3/4 of an hour south of Kendal, the town where William Tyrrell was reported missing. Driving this dirt road, we pass between two walls of forest, the trees seeming to crowd closer in upon us. Then suddenly, the country opens. Wow. To our right, there are long, empty beaches, the blue sky, the sun sparkling in the water.
Oh,
Holy
wow.
fuck, it's gorgeous. Or it would be gorgeous if this wasn't the likely site of another unsolved murder. And, getting out of the car, the wind wasn't whipping in as sharp as knives across the ocean. This is a place called Mud Bishop's Point Reserve. You can hear the trees, and just over there's the water coming down from the Manning River, and it's a beautiful place. Out to our right there's just these golden beaches. But back in December 1996, a 38-year-old mum called Margaret Cox, she had 3 kids. She was last seen on a Thursday night in Tyrrell, which is about 20 kilometres away from here. And a couple of days later, her body was found in the water near here. Margaret's underwear, carrying the DNA of 4 other people, was found at the picnic reserve, near where Nina and I are standing. Like Helen Harrison, whose death we looked at in the last episode, Margaret's killing is still unsolved, meaning her family don't have any answers, except that a coroner found she had been raped, was killed by blunt force injuries to her head, and that it wasn't possible to say if Margaret was still alive when her body was put in the water. And the other thing the coroner found was that it was most likely a local who was involved in whatever happened to Margaret, because this area's a long way out of town, at the end of a long dirt road. There's no street lights, so you come here at night and it would be pitch dark. The only light would be your car headlights. And you'd have to be a local to even know this place existed. I'm Dan Box, and from news.com.au, this is Witness, William Tyrrell. Episode 14, Margaret.
Thank you, gentlemen.
All right, guys.
Stop recording.
To get a sense of why Margaret's case is still unsolved, almost 30 years later, Nina and I sit down again with Gary Jubelin, the former detective who once led the investigation into William Tyrrell's disappearance. All right, hey, listen, what we're going to do is talk you through these 2 unrelated cases.
Yep.
So we talked you through Helen Harrison before, and we're just trying to get your sense on anything that comes to mind, particularly about the investigation.
Okay.
So it's December of 1996, It's the 19th of December. It's a Thursday before Christmas. Margaret Cox was a 38-year-old single mum. She had 3 children. And on that Thursday, Margaret had spent the day with family and friends. They'd been consuming some alcohol, some marijuana. Then the group went out in the evening and they decided to walk from Cundletown to Tyrrell in order to go to a nightclub.
It's about 5 kilometres straight down the road. Tyrrell itself is the big city on this stretch of the mid-north coast, but it's not that big. With just over 20,000 people living there, it shouldn't be that easy for someone to get lost.
Around midnight, they stopped at a service station, which was where the Big Oyster was at the time.
Yep.
The Big Oyster is just that, a big sculpture of an oyster. It's meant, I think, to celebrate the local oyster farming industry, and it's kind of, well, it's enormous and kind of goofy and kind of impressive and also kind of ugly.
Big Oyster's still there, service station has moved. And somehow during this point, Margaret gets separated from the group.
Yep.
And no one's really sure what happened at that point. The theory is that she either gets into someone's car for a lift or is taken in someone's car.
Essentially, she's not seen after this point at the service station.
And that's 12 midnight service station?
Yeah.
Okay. How many people was she with?
We don't know the number. 2 people who worked at the service station told police they saw Margaret with either another man or 2 men who bought a cigarette lighter and then left. But someone else told the police that he saw Margaret at the service station surrounded by a group of men and screaming. So it's all confusing.
I mean, I'll say up front that we did apply for the coronial inquest files for this case. And even though I applied in October, I haven't received them. Dan, you've also applied.
Yep, I got sent the findings, which is a single page.
Yeah.
Not much help.
The inquest into Margaret's death was held in 2010, 14 years after she was murdered. And the coroner's findings say the cause of her death was blunt force injuries to her head inflicted on her by person or persons unknown. And the evidence available does not enable me to make a finding as to the place of death.
So that was a Thursday night. The following Saturday morning, Margaret's body was found floating in the Manning River.
So if you don't know Tyrrell, Tyrrell's on the Manning River, and then that flows down to the coast, and it splits in 2 and goes around this big island and then hits the coast.
Yeah.
And some of her clothing was found in a picnic area called Mud Bishop's Reserve, where the police and later the coroner theorised that she was sexually assaulted multiple times.
Yep.
The police pretty quickly formed the opinion that they thought the killer was local, mainly because it's not an area that you'd likely find and access late at night if you weren't already aware of that area. Dan and I actually went to this area.
Yeah.
I would agree, it's pretty hard.
There's no way you'd know about it unless you knew the area.
And that assumption is a reasonable assumption if we're looking at an area that if you're from out of town, you don't even know about it. So I think that's a reasonable assumption.
And the other point is it's not in Tyrrell. So she's last seen in Tyrrell, and then Mud Bishop's Reserve where her clothes are found and the coroner and the police think that she was assaulted. That's a decent drive, maybe 10, 15 minutes, but it's out of Tyrrell, down following the river, you hit another little town called Old Bar, and then from there, it's not easy to find your way up to this reserve.
Okay.
People fish there, people might go there for, I don't know, teenagers might drink there. It's not an obvious place to go at all.
Mm-hmm.
So the police first, they looked at the ex-boyfriend. He was a truck driver, and he'd actually driven from Grafton, I think, to Tyrrell, and he'd signed in at a nearby sailing club on the Thursday night that Margaret went missing. So he's an obvious person to talk to.
Yep.
They spoke to him. He said the relationship ended weeks before, and he had an alibi.
Yep.
So they kind of scratched him. Police interviewed everyone they could find who'd been on the highway that day, so thousands of inquiries. They spoke to fishermen who'd been near where the clothing was recovered, and they treated some of those as potential suspects at first. Police learned that upstream at a bridge, some people had heard screaming on the night that Margaret went missing, but the investigation started to feel like it was getting bogged down. 3 homicide detectives from Newcastle came up, spent several months in Tyrrell. Another couple of detectives came up and took the lead from the local cops. So at this point, does that sound like a comprehensive police response?
Well, they're treating it seriously if they've notified homicide. So you'd send a team of 3. That seems normal. With the family, who was with her? Was anyone from the family with her at the time of her disappearance?
Yeah. So that day and that night, she was with family and friends.
Yeah. Okay. My instinct from a homicide detective, the answer lies at the service station, which pretty much stating the obvious, seeing it was the last place she was seen alive. But how has she wandered off from a group with no one in the group knowing?
The answer to how Margaret got separated from the group might be in old newspaper reports, which Nina found in the State Library. These say that Margaret was one of 4 people drinking together that night. They say the group drank 2 bottles of Jim Beam and a 4-litre cask of wine. One of the group later described Margaret saying she could stand up, but if you asked her to walk in a straight line, it would have never happened. So, pretty drunk. About 11 or 11:30 that night, the group somehow drove from Tyrrell to nearby Cundletown to keep drinking. Only they ran out of drink in Cundletown, so 3 of them, including Margaret, walked back. Then that group split. Margaret wanted to get a cigarette lighter, so she went to the service station, and the other 2 walked on to a caravan park to call on a friend.
My focus, if I was looking at an investigation, being called out to that would be focusing very much on everyone's movements. Was anyone showing a particular interest in her that night? A group going for a drink, kicking on a nightclub, invariably people are starting to pair up, or someone that's shown an interest in her that night.
Thinking that he might be their man.
Up until at least we get to like the 10-year anniversary of the crime, the police are still saying in the media, this can be solved. Yep. They don't seem like they've given up.
They also don't seem to have had much success. For different reasons, different police officers were put in charge of the case over the years, and none of them was able to be certain where exactly Margaret died. There was no blood or sign of a struggle, meaning they didn't have a lot of evidence.
There's at least 3 or 4 persons of interest that were named at the inquest. So early on, the police released a photo fit of a man that they believed had been camping in the Mud Bishops Reserve area. And they released an image of him and a description of his car, which was a white 4-wheel drive Land Rover. And as a result of that, a number of people identified the same man as being the man from that photo.
That man was not Frank Abbott.
Mud Bishop Reserve was where her clothing was found.
Yeah.
I see the primary crime scene, I would suggest, is the service station. I don't get overly excited about the secondary crime scene, someone in the area. And again, this is just what's going through my mind, in that, why did she get to that location? She didn't have a car. How did she get to the picnic area where her clothing was found?
Because she's got to get there.
Yeah. So it's who meets her at the service station and takes her there.
That's where I'd be looking. I wouldn't be overly concerned who was around where her clothes were dumped.
But the coroner ultimately ruled that there was not enough evidence to point to a likely killer or to charge anyone. They also mentioned DNA.
Yep.
So the coroner mentioned that there was a DNA of 4 people on Margaret's underwear.
Yep.
3 of those people have been identified and 1 hasn't.
Right, okay. Certainly if her clothes have been dumped, her body has been dumped in a river, and it looks like she's been sexually assaulted, the DNA on the underwear would be of vital interest.
Yeah, but presumably if they've identified 3 of those people, they aren't suspects. They must have been ruled out.
Again, the media reports are confusing, but it looks like 3 of those DNA profiles were identified, and 2 of them ruled out as suspects at the inquest, leaving 1 other identified person and a 4th DNA profile that's never been identified. But one thing does stand out from the media reports, and that is that Margaret had a bandage on her left arm. One newspaper report says she suffered a very extensive laceration on her left arm shortly before her death. Another report is different. That one says that she'd had what it calls certain surgery earlier that December.
So I keep coming back to, if you're looking at the person of interest, you're looking at someone that was in the group.
Or who met the group at that service station.
Potentially met the group at the service station, but again, then you've got that random meeting of a predator and the victim at a location where you wouldn't expect to find the victim.
Yeah, okay. So that's all that was known at the time.
Yeah.
And since then, essentially nothing. Until the William Tyrrell inquest. Shut the gate?
Yes, please. We don't use that gate.
This is Iris Northam. She's a kind face and slightly plump and smiling older woman. She looks like a grandma out of Central Casting. Hello, how are you doing?
My husband, Dooley.
Good to meet you, Dooley. My name's Dan, and this is Nina.
Hi, Dooley.
Pleased to meet you. Iris and her husband Dooley live in a little single-storey brick house surrounded by bright flowers in Old Bar, the tiny town just down the dirt road from where Margaret's clothing was discovered. Nina and I have come to visit them because of a witness statement which we found among dozens of other exhibits released to us by the coroner from the inquest into William Tyrrell's disappearance. That witness statement is from Iris, and it sets out the evidence that she'd be prepared to give as a witness in court. That statement is also the first time the story of Margaret Cox's disappearance and her murder intersects with our story about Frank Abbott. And its full contents have never been made public before now.
Yeah, so you're doing a follow-up on this podcast, yeah.
Would you be all right if I recorded? Yeah, great.
In her witness statement to the William Tyrrell inquest, Iris explains how she first met Frank Abbott.
His father was a customer of ours. We had the scrap metal yard.
In Tyrrell, right?
Yeah. And his father used to bring a bit of scrap metal in and sell it. Yeah. And one day he just come in, he said, my son Frank's looking for a job. He can do anything, but he's been in jail. He'd only just got out of something.
That noise you can hear in the background is me talking to Iris's husband, Dooley. Dooley's getting on these days. He's stooped over, he struggles to walk, and it's hard to break away from the conversation.
And my husband said, yeah, bring him in if you can do the work, whatever I want done. And then when he came in, he, just talked like a normal person. He didn't.
Good first impression?
Yeah. And then when he started work, you just ask him to do something, he'd go, I'll do it. No back chat or anything. He just,
hard worker?
Yeah. He didn't talk that much. But if you talk to him, he'd sort of answer and whatever. But he only worked for us for, about 12 months, I suppose. Mightn't have been that long.
The reason Frank stopped working for them was that he got arrested in 1991 over the murder of Helen Harrison, which we talked about in the last episode.
One day, one of the policemen come to our place and he said, Frank Abbott's not going to be working for you anymore. He said, we just arrested him for murder. And I said, what?
Frank was found not guilty.
He just said that everything was cleared. I said he was not guilty.
By now, Dooley and I are both sitting at the kitchen table listening to Iris. I ask her, did it ever worry you that Frank was put on trial for murder?
It sort of Sort of did, but it, you sort of didn't sort of press on it too much.
Instead, they stayed friendly, Iris says. Frank and Dooley used to gamble together on the horses.
They were punters. Of course, they'd ring up, so-and-so's racing today. And anyway, Frank moved to Johns River, and he'd ring up and he'd say, "What do you fancy for race number 6 in Sydney," or something? And they'd be talking away there for, half an hour. Think, "Oh, yeah, this one's a good one, that one." And they'd just chatter on. Just mates.
Just mates. For years. And Iris doesn't seem to bear Frank any malice today. Did you ever hear any other stories about him? People saying things about him?
Since. Quite a lot.
What have you heard? Then we start talking about Margaret and what Iris says in her statement to the William Tyrrell inquest.
When Margaret Cox went missing, she went missing on a Thursday night. On the Saturday morning, they found a body in the river. And on the Sunday, we went to an auction. There was a fellow used to have an auction every month. And the Dooley said, "Oh, there's Frank. We've got a few minutes before, we've got to be there." So we went over and we were talking with Frank. And anyway, Dooley said to him, "Frank, what did you do to your arm?" Because he had all these gouge marks on his arm. And Frank just said, "Oh, oysters." That was it.
Oysters, from the local oyster beds around Tyrrell, the ones that inspired the big oyster. In the wild, oysters have really sharp shells. They scratch. In her statement, Iris says Frank had about 7 or 8 gouge marks between his left wrist and his elbow.
No, oysters don't do that. I fell on oysters once and they don't do that, they just slash.
So what was the difference with these?
They were gouge marks, like someone had gouged skin out,
like with
the actual flesh out.
Like with their fingernails gouged out?
Yeah.
So these weren't like
No.
So, and did you think anything of that at the time?
Well, I did and I didn't.
Speaking to Gary Jubelin, Nina reads out this section from Iris's statement to the inquest.
The gouge marks were long and straight,
Yep.
and they looked to be a couple of days old, as they had that kind of festy look that wounds get before they start to heal.
Yep.
I remember thinking that the marks on his arm really didn't match what he was telling us.
As a former homicide detective, I asked Gary, do you read anything into that?
It is concerning. There's been a lot of murders solved by someone carrying injuries that obviously what appear to be wounds with someone struggling if they're being attacked. Oyster marks as distinct from straight scratches. Yeah, I offer a concern there. I worry with contamination of Frank Abbott because his reputation is so well known that people, what we know about Frank Abbott is he's a grub. You're testing memories from, 96, if it was at the inquest we're looking at.
30 years, yeah.
30 years down the track. I don't know, I'm trying to think 30 years back. Can I recall a specific injury or how it looks? Memory can do some funny things. So I wouldn't get overly excited, but I'd be curious where Frank is certainly opportunity, motive, capability, as I always talk about. He would have the motivation because he seems to be, in my understanding, a sexual predator. Capability, opportunity, that's that missing ingredient.
Meaning, can you prove Frank had the opportunity to do anything to Margaret? So far, the answer's no. We can't even say Frank ever met her. Although there is a line in Iris's witness statement about
10-pin bowling.
She says Frank used to bowl in Tyrrell on a Thursday night. It was a Thursday night that Margaret was last seen in Tyrrell.
And so the bowling alley, and I've confirmed it is the same bowling alley and hasn't moved, is 5 minutes away from that service station. We went to the bowling alley and I said, can you tell me who was bowling here 30 years ago?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
they can't. But they gave me the name of someone who did bowl there 30 years ago, and I tracked that guy down.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he's a Tuesday, Wednesday bowler, not a Thursday bowler.
Which at least corroborates that there was bowling on a Thursday.
Okay.
Yes.
And the other thing we heard is that bowling was big then, and
Big.
people would bowl late into the night. Which proves nothing. We don't know if Frank was bowling on that Thursday, or what time the bowling finished, or if that was the same time Margaret was last seen at the service station.
I tried to be a detective, Gary.
I tried to be a detective too. That didn't work out.
But there is one other thing in Iris's statement to the William Tyrrell inquest. She says Frank had another mate.
Yes, Noel.
Yeah.
Noel Sonter.
Yeah. Could you tell us a bit more about what Noel told you about Frank?
In her witness statement, Iris says she and her husband told Noel about seeing Frank with oyster scratches after Margaret was murdered.
Dooley sort of mentioned it to him. And Noel said, I'm sure that's the woman that I saw at Frank's. With Frank. He said she had a bandage or something on her arm. And I said, I don't know whether she had any bandages or anything, but...
So when Noel told you this, that he'd seen Margaret at Frank's place with the bandage on her arm, did he say when that was?
Only a few days before.
A few days before?
Yeah.
And
Might have been a week, but it was only a few days.
Shortly
right?
before?
Yeah.
so Frank's mate Noel says he saw Margaret at Frank's house sometime before she was murdered. And Noel recognised her from the bandage, which we know she did have on her left arm. As far as we can tell, this claim that Noel saw Margaret at Frank's house has never been made public. Not at the inquest into Margaret's death in 2010, nor at the inquest into William's disappearance that ended last year.
Shortly after Noel had told us, it was only probably 4 or 5 days.
Iris says her husband Dooley and Noel did try to tell police about seeing Margaret at Frank's place.
Noel had been doing something for us, I'm not sure what it was now. But anyway, Dooley was taking him home because he lived at Johns River, pretty near Obadiah. And there was a police blockade there.
There'd been some kind of traffic incident.
And they said, we're just stopping people. And Dooley and Noel tried to tell him about Margaret being there at his place.
But the cop didn't seem interested.
The fellow said, no, we've got someone for that. That's it.
As in, the cops already had a suspect.
They had 3 or 4 different people. And I've sort of gone through what could have been, what might have happened.
Meaning, what might have happened if the cop that day had listened when they tried to tell him about Margaret. So, what did happen? To answer that, Nina tracks down the detective who first led the investigation into Margaret's death. His name is Dave Woolnough, and we drive out to meet him and sit with Dave and his wife at the table in their cosy kitchen, reading out Iris Northam's witness statement, while Dave sits there without moving, his eyes closed, chin on his hands, because he's never heard any of this before now. And Dave, I think, is a good man who did his best with the investigation and who deeply regrets not being able to give Margaret's family an answer as to who killed her. We keep talking. After more than 2 hours together, Nina and I finally stand, shake hands, and leave. So that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah.
So we've just been talking to a cop, Dave Woolnough, and he led the investigation into Margaret Cox's murder back in 1996 in Tyrrell. And at the moment he doesn't want to be recorded, but I think we can say what we said to each other. And the first thing I didn't expect is that as well as Dave, we met his wife, June. And while Dave was the cop who led the investigation into Margaret's murder, June was the nurse who treated Margaret in the week before she went missing.
Yes, which is not information that I had from media reports.
I didn't know either. And this is the bit that got me, was we talked about the investigation and we talked about different things, and we were there for a good long time, a couple of hours. But then June said that Margaret was in the hospital right up until just before she went missing. In fact, June said she was working the night shift and she worked the Thursday night. Margaret went missing on the Thursday night. And June said she came into the hospital and Margaret was gone. But she also said something that got your attention, didn't it?
Yeah, so she said that Margaret was being treated for an infection.
Yeah.
And that she had left hospital. She had had a PICC line in treating this infection.
Yeah, so an intravenous line going into her arm.
Yeah. And that caught my attention because of Iris Northam's statement.
Yeah.
And in that statement, she said that Noel Sonter, who was a friend of hers and a friend of Frank's, said that he had seen Margaret Cox at Frank's house shortly before the murder and that she had a bandage on her arm.
And this is the thing, that when I read that in Iris Northam's statement, I thought it kind of doesn't mean anything. You've got a second-hand account that somebody saw Margaret at Frank's house, kind of so what, until June told us that Margaret was in hospital until the day she went missing and she was discharged with a bandage on her arm.
Yeah.
And Iris then says a couple of days after Margaret goes missing, she sees Frank with those scratch marks down his arm. Suddenly all of that seems much, much more important than it did before.
And it gives a frame of reference as well, because her statement says shortly before the murder.
Yeah.
Which, could mean days, weeks, hours. But the fact that she had the bandage on her arm and we've got the nurse that discharged her saying she was discharged that day with the bandage on her arm.
So that puts her at Frank's house the day she went missing. Have the police followed this up when they got Iris's statement? Well, we know they haven't spoken to June, who was the treating nurse, but maybe they wouldn't. And we know they haven't spoken to the cop we just met, Dave, who led the investigation, but maybe they wouldn't. But have the police followed up with anyone about that statement that Frank might actually have been with Margaret on the day she went missing before she disappeared? Everyone around the table in that kitchen today was a little bit shocked by that.
You've got me more interested in the fact if Frank Abbott knew her. That sort of changes the dynamics a bit.
We go back and ask Gary Jubelin, as a former cop, if this evidence about Margaret being at Frank's house changes anything.
I'd be looking, if I was looking at this investigation fresh, like in the actual time period, you got Frank, if he knows the victim. To me, it feels like a local type crime. If I was looking at it, I'd be looking for someone in the area.
It might also mean that Frank knew she was going out that night. If she was the woman with a bandage on her arm seen at Frank's house.
And if she was seen at Frank's house, if we're linking the bandage on the arm to being discharged from hospital, so it's contemporary, it's not, saw her in the house 10 years before. So was Frank Abbott's reputation out and about at that stage?
No, so it's interesting. We asked about this because Frank was arrested in 1991 in Tyrrell. And then he goes through both of his trials where he's
Yep.
found not guilty over the murder of Helen Harrison. That all wraps up in 94, 95. So I did ask the investigator who was leading the investigation to Margaret's death, were you aware of Frank in the community and that he'd been, charged with a crime like that? And would that make you more likely to look at him? And he kind of said no, that they weren't really aware.
So they didn't know that Frank was living in the area and had just been acquitted of abducting, sexually assaulting and murdering a teenage girl.
It shouldn't happen. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, that police would miss that. And I'm thinking back to 96. I was in homicide. I know how to operate. A person's name comes up in the investigation and you'd be looking at their past history, and it certainly flagged that if he was charged and acquitted of a murder,
Well,
you'd
Frank's
be looking
name
at...
didn't come up in the investigation.
So this information about knowing the victim, Margaret, has come up basically...
It's come up as a result of the William Tyrrell inquest.
Right.
It has.
But, yeah, there's a lot of missing pieces.
That's one question I wanted to ask you, is if you were in Unsolved handling this, and so it would come to the police as a result of Iris giving this statement in the William Tyrrell inquest, would you be getting in touch with Margaret Cox's family to say, we've got some information?
If I was in Unsolved Homicide, which I have been in Unsolved Homicides, I'd want to have a look at what's gone on, speak to the family, maybe get access to the brief and answer all the questions that I'm asking.
Would you go back to Iris after that statement was made?
Iris being
The woman who made this statement for the inquest.
Oh, yeah, that would be an obvious one.
And would you go back to Noel Saunter, the guy who apparently said he saw Margaret at Frank's house?
I'd be going back to them armed with all the information that you've provided now to sit down and potentially get additional information based on the information that you're forthcoming.
So what if I told you that Iris gave that statement in 2019?
Yeah.
So we're 5 years on and they've not heard anything from the police?
I'd be disappointed, but I'm used to being disappointed.
Gary isn't the only one who's disappointed that the police haven't followed up with Iris about Margaret Cox's murder.
Well, that's it, yes. And
This is Iris.
when the coroner come here and he was, asking questions and things, and I mentioned that,
Iris says someone from the coronial team investigating William Tyrrell's disappearance came to her house to take her statement and sat where Nina and I are now sitting.
one of the girls that was with him said, we'll mention it to the cold case detectives.
The cold case detectives is the unsolved homicide team. David Laidlaw, who's running the police investigation into William's disappearance, is one of that team's commanders.
But whether she did or not, I don't know.
So you've never heard back
No,
from the police?
no.
So this was...
That was 2019.
And the coroner's lawyers came here, and you obviously told them about
Yeah.
the scratch marks. They said they'd tell the unsolved
The cold
homicide
case,
team, and you've never heard anything since.
Never heard, no. So I don't know whether they said anything or just completely forgot about it or...
And did you hear back from the police since the inquest?
No.
Iris did give evidence in person at William's inquest, but that inquest wasn't looking at Margaret's murder, and Iris was only asked about part of what's in her statement. The rest hasn't been made public before now. Talking to us, Iris says it was one of who she calls the girls who interviewed her at home to get her statement, who said they'd passed the information on to the cold case unit. We don't know who that person was, though Iris's statement is signed by a female police detective who was on the strike force investigating William's disappearance. So we know at least that she was in the room. And we know no one has gone back since to talk to Iris.
Well, I could probably say something, but I might just think I'm a flaming idiot.
But you think they should talk to you?
Well, at times I think, I've got to say something. Even if it's just to ring the cold case mob up and find out whether the others said anything about it.
They got your information.
Yeah.
I do want to say, I think you're feeling a lot of responsibility.
Oh, yes.
You have told someone and you have done your part. You should know that.
Well, yes, but I didn't follow it up. I haven't followed it up.
It's not your job to follow it up.
Not really, but I would like to know whether she did see someone down there or mention it to someone.
That's a good question. We asked New South Wales Police if this evidence about Frank and Margaret was passed on to the Unsolved Homicide team in 2019, and if they had done anything to investigate it. The police declined to answer.
I'm getting older, Noel's getting older, whether he's even still around to give any sort of evidence.
Iris is right to say she's getting older. Her husband Dooley, who knew Frank well, is no longer really up to being interviewed or giving evidence. And what about Frank's other mate, Noel Saunter, the man who apparently saw Margaret at Frank's house with a bandage on her left arm shortly before she was murdered?
Hello?
Hi, is that Uta?
Yes, it is.
Eventually, we track Noel down. This is his wife. I tell her what we're doing. I'm a reporter, and for the past couple of years, I've been working on a podcast series about the investigation into the disappearance of that little lad, William Tyrrell, who went missing 10 years ago now.
Yep.
Uta explains Noel is also getting older and also no longer really up for being interviewed. But he is with her in the room as she and I are talking. Reason to speak to yourself is that in one of the exhibits that came out of the inquest, there was a witness statement given by a woman called Iris Northam, who's...
Yes, I know Iris and I know her husband, yep.
In her statement, Iris is talking about this woman who went missing in Tyrrell and was subsequently found dead, a woman called Margaret Cox.
Yep.
She was the mum of three who was found near Old Bar.
Yes. My personal opinion is I don't think they've investigated Frank Abbott enough.
Yeah.
But, that's just my opinion.
Iris gave this statement to the inquest, which mentions Noel seeing Margaret and Frank together. She gave this statement 4 or 5 years ago, roughly. Have you heard from the police in that time?
Trying to think. We were already in this house and we've been in this house now for, when did we move in? Just over 6 years. It must be about 5 years ago, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
When we got the message from the police, never heard from them again. It was a woman and she said she'd call back, and that's the last I heard.
So you've never heard from the police about Margaret Cox?
No.
Has he ever mentioned Margaret to you? Or
I remember Noel saying that he saw a woman in Frank's house. She had her arm in a sling or something, Noel, you said? Mm-hmm. Noel doesn't talk so well anymore. Wrapped up in a bandage in Frank's house.
And did he say who he thought that woman was?
No. You don't remember who that was, do you? No.
Okay. So Noel, today, 5 years on from when Iris gave her statement about Margaret, Noel doesn't remember or can't say if he remembers who the woman was that he saw in Frank's house, just that she was wearing a bandage. And as it stands, that's not evidence of anything. And maybe Noel was mistaken about who was with Frank. Too many years have passed since Margaret died, and since Iris gave her evidence to the inquest. But you do think The police could have been asking these questions back in 2019 when Iris first spoke up. And they haven't.
We've all said all along that the police never investigated Frank enough.
What makes you say that?
He was just, there was just something about Frank. I didn't like him, and I never liked him, but it was, Noel's friend and whatnot. But he was just creepy. That's the best way I can describe it, really.
Did he do anything particular that made you think he was creepy?
Just, he'd brush up against you. Just, yeah.
Brush up against you?
Yeah, he was just, I tried to stay away from him. And because we lived so close, he used to call in quite regularly. So it was a bit, just, I think anybody who you talk to about Frank would probably tell you the same thing. He had a beautiful daughter.
Yeah.
I can't remember the daughter's name. She was gorgeous. She was really lovely,
Do you have any idea what happened to her?
I have no idea.
We haven't been able to contact Frank's daughter either. And if you're out there and you want to talk, there's an email address in the show notes. We've written to Frank Abbott in prison, where he's serving time for child sex offences, about Margaret Cox and whether he ever met her. He hasn't responded to our questions. So this is what we do know. We know the police and the inquest team investigating William's disappearance were told back in 2019 about one of their persons of interest and his alleged links to a young woman who was murdered. We know the woman who gave that evidence was told it would be passed on to the unsolved homicide team, but no one from the police has contacted her since. Nor have the police contacted the other alleged witness she mentioned, Noel Saunter. And as we learn more about Margaret's death, that begins to seem completely inexplicable. Because we learn there was once a dedicated police task force called Task Force Metz, who reportedly looked for any links between Margaret's killing and 3 other unsolved murders. So Nina and I start looking at those 3 killings, and we find there are others. Other unsolved murders here on the New South Wales North Coast. And the Iris Northam statement to the inquest into William's disappearance links Frank to yet another of those cold cases. But that has never been made public. Until now. That's next time on Witness William Tyrrell. A lot of different people have been involved in making this series. Among them, the executive producer is Nina Young. The sound design was by Tiffany Dimmack. The producers have been Emily Pidgeon, Nicholas Adams-Jasbar, Phoebe Zakowski-Wallace and Tabby Wilson. Research by Aidan Patrick. Original music by Rory O'Connor. Our lawyer is Stephen Coombs. The editor at news.com.au is Kerry Warren. I'm Dan Box.